From Southern California, this is The Circle of Insight, a show about everything in psychology. Hear the latest in news and views on psychology. Our motto is simple: wherever there is psychology involved, we are there. And now, here's your host of The Circle of Insight, Carlos Vasquez.
Hi everyone, and welcome to The Circle of Insight. My name is Carlos Vasquez, doctoral candidate in psychology and the host of The Circle of Insight, where we discuss the topics that you have chosen with leading experts. Our motto is simple: wherever there's psychology involved, we are there. Today we're going to be talking about Halloween. Over 150 million Americans celebrate Halloween. $7 billion is spent on this one-day holiday. So today we have author and Halloween historian Lesley Bannatyne to explain to us Halloween and where it came from. How are you, Lesley?
Hi, I'm fine, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for being on the show. We're excited to have you. We're excited to talk about this. And before we get started on Halloween, I wanted to get a little bit of background about you and how got you interested in Halloween and looking up the research and history about this, because this is a great book. And by the way, let me show the book before we go on. Wonderful book, Halloween, An American Holiday and American History by Lesley Bannatyne. So how did you get started on this?
I really have always loved Halloween, but I was a freelance writer 25, 30 years ago. And there was a publishing house that was buying holiday books. And my literary agent friend said, hey, there are two left. You can have Halloween or you can have Election Day. So I went with Halloween, went down the rabbit hole, and just like anything else, once you know something about a subject, it gets larger and bigger and deeper. And I just kept going. So I now have 5 books.
5 books on Halloween?
Yeah, on Halloween.
Wow, that's fantastic. So I am talking to the right person.
Yeah.
So let's get started on it. Where did this holiday come from?
Most people will trace it back to a precursor of Halloween called Samhain, which means summer's end. It was a time of year celebrated in northwestern Europe. That's Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Brittany, Great Britain. About 2,000 years ago, and it was a time when you brought in the herds from summer pasture, you got the tribes together, and it was a celebration. It was a festival, like our Thanksgiving, more. And because it was there on the cusp of winter, it had a little bit of a dangerous element to it. It was going into the dark and the cold and the dangerous season. So there was an element of supernatural associated with this time of year, summer's end. And that's really where you get the very first supernatural parts of Halloween, and that's where it all sort of begins.
Now, this is BC?
Yes, this is BC. So there was only oral history, as you can imagine. The only reason that we know about Samhain is because medieval Irish monks writing between around the 9th century and the 12th century were looking to capture these stories before they disappeared forever. Part of their intention was to give Ireland the kind of mythology that Greece or Rome might have. And they thought these stories were really important because they could date some of them as far back as the 5th century, 4th century, just by how they were written down, the oral quirks they had. So these are old stories, and that's where we hear about Samhain. That's where we hear about this summer's end. And it was a time, kings were slaughtered, great loves were consummated, monsters crawled out of mounds. And this is the kind of mythology that we have about this time of year.
Now, is there any association with, I know that a lot of people try to associate it with the Druids.
Mm-hmm. Well, only because the Druids were the priestly caste of the Celtic tribes. And so Druids would have had the function of looking into the future, which they would have done on all important days. And Samhain was certainly an important time to look into the future and figure out what was going to happen next. So they figured into it that way. The institution that had probably more influence on Halloween was the Catholic Church, which, Christianized all of its empire, including Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, and put 2 holidays at this time of year. All Saints' Day on November 1st, which is known as All Hallows in some part of the world. So All Hallows Eve becomes Halloween the night before. But more importantly, November 2nd, All Souls Day, because that created this really wonderful interactive relationship between the living and the dead in the Catholic Church, and that is still very much a part of Halloween.
And that was during what time period was that? In the 300-400 AD?
Well, no, yeah, you're right about the Christianization, but it hit the British Isles a little bit later. But the All Saints' Day was put in around 835, and All Souls' Day not till 1000 A.D. So for the past 1,000 years, at least, we've been looking for the dead at this time of year.
And it seems like is that a universal concept in the regards to? I know a lot of the calendars in those days, and I'm talking 100 A.D. and BC. A lot of them were based on agriculture.
Yes.
And a lot of them associated the darkness with maybe the dead walking around, the spirits coming back to visit. I know there's some kind of association there with Halloween.
Absolutely, and you're right that it's not just this culture. It's just about every culture has an association between darkness and otherworldly creatures. Ours just happens to be All Saints and All Souls Day, in this country, and Halloween in this country. But no, it's widespread. The idea of looking for danger in the darkness, it's common.
And that's actually interesting because that comment, I know later on in the show, we're taking this temporal journey of Halloween, and I know later you're going to discuss more why it's so popular today. Mm-hmm. It seemed like it was popular back then even, but maybe more so today.
Well, yeah, those two church holidays, and they were church holidays, they weren't our Halloween yet, were some of the most important medieval church holidays, so they were really important, and everybody would have known about them who was Catholic at that time. It's Halloween becomes a secular holiday when the Reformation hits and Scotland goes Protestant, and not just Protestant but Calvinist. So in the Scottish mindset of the 16th century, ghosts are now sleights of Satan, and to commemorate the dead would be heathenism. And so all these beliefs that people had about this time of year, they're kind of cut off from the church ritualistically, but they don't go away. And so they migrate out into the worlds of folklore and superstition and get attached to the evening before All Saints' Day, All Hallows' Eve, and become for the first time a secular holiday where people gather together. It's a family holiday. It's, food and drinks and games. But there is an otherworldly cast on it still. It's the Night of the Witches.
The Night of the Witches.
The Night of the Witches.
Now, before we leave the Celts and the Druids behind, is there anything else that you found fascinating in your research on them that might relate to Halloween?
There are many references of Samhain in those Celtic sagas, but it's not anything like our Halloween except for this supernatural part of it. It's very much it's very much a big celebration in a tribe. And it's one of the equivalent of modern football games. It's getting everybody together and playing games, and, a little bit of looking into the future, a little bit of worrying about monsters and things like that. But mostly this is a time you got together and drank a lot, ate a lot, bragged a lot, and wrestled, played games. It's interesting that kind of is more Thanksgiving, but what we do now on Thanksgiving.
That is funny. All right, so we'll leave the Druids and the Celts behind now. We'll move forward. I know you had a chapter on immigration, and before I touch upon that, I've read in the past that the Irish were the ones that brought over Halloween.
They had a lot to do with it because there was a huge, as you know, a huge Irish immigration. Before that, the Scots were here in the 18th century. They would have known about Halloween. The Irish that followed them 100 years later would have known about Samhain or Halloween. But these were new immigrants, and they did not, come over and start celebrating it as a holiday. What they brought with them more was their folklore. So, beliefs, things they told each other late at night at certain points of year, like if you stand in the crossroads at midnight on Halloween, you can hear the future whispered in the wind. Or if you peel an apple in one pairing and throw it over your left shoulder, it'll land in the initial of the person that you're going to marry. Or You can conjure up the spirit of your future love by cooking a meal and eating it in complete silence and setting a place for them. I mean, these are the kind of folklore things that came over that you can find in this country wherever the Irish migrated and wherever there are large settlements of Scottish people. And then it just, this being a country of many, many, many immigrants, the folklore and superstition just starts to meld together. So you get new beliefs, say, for example, about black cats from Africans who are coming and working in the South, or Germans who settle in Pennsylvania and New York State who bring an incredibly vivid witchcraft lore. It all kind of gets put together in a great big pot, and we have a very superstitious time of year.
That's fascinating. Well, I'm trying to figure out how to say the next question here. Well, I know, did you do any research in regards to how it's celebrated around the world?
Not so much. I concentrate on America. I mean, I keep up with it. I read what other people have written about what's happening with Halloween in other parts of the world, especially now, since we've globally exported it, and you can find Halloween in Russia and Halloween in South Africa. But that's not my specific area.
That's fine. That's good. I was curious. I know there were some. I was surprised when I found out there were other nations that were actually celebrating Halloween. And I was really surprised. I think the only nation that has as a national holiday was Ireland.
Ireland, yeah, it's a bank holiday. That comes from the strong tradition of All Saints' Day. I mean, it's still a very important Catholic holiday.
Hi, welcome to Adelante. This is Adelante Recovery, and my name is Yvette Kuglin, and I'm part of the staff.
Adelante Recovery Center has helped people in dual diagnosis for 5 years. We accept most PPO insurances and provide luxury accommodations and 24-hour support. To speak with an admissions counselor, call 1-888-242-4450.
A lot of time we don't even know what's wrong with us, and sometimes we need to get away to figure that out. So if you want to go for a little retreat out in Corona Del Mar, which is a confidential location, we're here to help. So we're only a phone call away. Thank you.
Is there any more you want to talk about in regards to the immigration?
Um,
Or did you pretty much cover that just a minute ago?
Well, although these superstitions existed and still do exist among ethnic communities, you didn't really have a Halloween party yet. That was the Victorians, and that happened late in the 19th century. There were plenty of immigrants. There was plenty of folklore that was recorded later about Halloween or about lots of different times of year, that special times of year, just like the Celts. This was a propitious time of year. But it wasn't until the Victorians that there were really Halloween parties. There may have been pockets of ethnic celebrations among Scots, Irish, Welsh people who brought their traditions from the old world. But the big push on Halloween came after the Civil War.
So let's talk a little bit about that, because I know you have a chapter in this book talking about the Victorian period. What were some of the things you found out that stood out?
Well, first of all, it was amazing to me that Halloween only became a holiday here because of a perfect storm of really three things. One was cheap printing. This was a time when paper got cheap, printing got cheap, and magazines and newspapers proliferated. The second was the Victorians were obsessed with death. After the Civil War, there was an incredible need for people to know what happened in the life after this one. They had lost so many people. Where's my son? Where's my husband? Are they coming back? Are they missing? Are they in a hospital somewhere? People were curious about death in a way that they hadn't been before after suffering so much death. And the third thing was the Victorians were also interested in exotic places, like the reports were coming in from Fiji and Borneo. The pyramids were uncovered in Egypt, and this whole world opened up. And so in these newspapers, hungry for content, the Victorians started to learn about this rural, strange, exotic holiday from Highland Scotland, they thought, because Highland Scotland was just about as exotic to them as Fiji or Borneo. And it had to do with ghosts, and they just loved it. And so most Victorians started to celebrate Halloween because they read about it in the newspapers and magazines and little reports that people would put in there. And they started to throw Halloween-themed parties.
Fascinating. That's amazing. So that's how it started here in America, in a sense.
That's how most parties started.
Most parties.
As a theme. It was a theme.
Christmas as well, I'm sure.
Yes.
So we talked about the Victorian period, and we covered really a lot of your book. There's a lot more in the book. So I highly recommend people who want more in-depth analysis of Halloween, really get a more fun understanding of it. Once again, it's an American holiday in American history by Lesley Bannatyne. She came out with a new book in 2011 called The Halloween Nation.
Right.
Now, the Halloween Nation kind of takes us right past the Victorian period into the more modern times,
Right.
where you discuss a little bit of why it's so popular today. So I wanted to explore that a little bit, and then after that, maybe we'll have some fun wrapping it up, talking about some of the folklore that we know about, where the Jackolantern came from, and the costumes and all that. But first, let's talk a little bit about why you think America's so head over heels about Halloween.
I think, well, it was a kids' holiday through most of the 20th century. You know, everyone celebrated at the very beginning. Adults, children's, whole town celebrated Halloween. But after World War II and the creation of suburbs and the baby boom, and there was a huge emphasis on kids in our culture, and Halloween became almost exclusively trick-or-treating. The suburbs made that possible. The emphasis on kids made that possible. The end of sugar rationing made candy possible. And so we had this huge, that became incredibly popular because kids were everything at that time. You know, moms stayed home and they made things for Halloween. They made costumes. And then those kids grew up, and starting in the late 70s, adults started to celebrate Halloween a lot more as well as kids. And many people will say it's because of nostalgia, because they loved it as kids and they wouldn't give it up. But there are other reasons. One of the main one is that Halloween, late in the 1970s, Halloween and horror came together. They hadn't been together before. Halloween had always been eerie, or spooky, or otherworldly, but not violent, not bloody, not serial killers, not horror.
Really?
But John Carpenter's 1978 Halloween, end of that. It was the first movie that gave the title Halloween. Halloween was a metaphor. It was set on Halloween. And that movie was so incredibly successful that from 1978 on, when you thought about Halloween, you thought about John Carpenter's Halloween, you thought about horror. And horror and Halloween kind of married in a way that they never had. And it was an interesting phenomenon because it brought young adults and teenagers back to celebrating Halloween. And it also kind of made horror a little bit more legitimate because it was something you did on Halloween, you know, horror film fests, or what we now see as zombie crawls and zombie proms and all this kind of stuff that came out because of that association with Halloween and horror. It kind of grew up a little bit. And that accelerated through the 80s and through the 90s and through the 21st century until we have, like you say, millions of people celebrating Halloween and spending $7 billion on it, 330 million of those on their pets.
How much is that?
330 million on pet
pets.
Costumes. Yeah.
Wow. That's amazing. 330 million. Let's explore if we can. We still have some time, and this is a psychology show, so I wanted to discuss a little bit. What do you think Halloween gives us? 'Cause I know you got John Carpenter and you brought that. Is it a safe way to look at these dangerous worlds or these scary concepts?
That's really a great way of putting it. Yes, at bottom, I think yes. There's a few things. Number one, you know, you can be whatever you want to be for that one night because it is one night. And there's a lot of precedent for being audacious. When adults first got back into Halloween, it was gay communities in certain parts of the countries that threw the very first audacious Halloween parades and kind of set the bar high for what you could do on Halloween. And I think it gives people a chance to do something they wouldn't ordinarily do. Whatever box you're in, you can come out of it, as long as it's that night. Because, come the morning of November 1st, you cannot dress like a marshmallow peep. You cannot chase your neighbor with a fake chainsaw. It's over in the morning. And it kind of ties, David Scal is a Halloween historian also, and he talks about how it ties into the American idea that you can be everything you want to be. You can be what you want to be. Anything. You can be anything. Well, that's true. But it also does have that dark side. And I think of it as like Halloween is not a dark holiday. It's visually dangerous now. Yeah, it's very extreme. It's bloody. People complain about that a lot. But it's the one time where you can kind of wrap your arms around that and make fun of it and be ironic, treat it with humor, satire. It's a time where you can control all that stuff that's very scary, which is why this year you saw all, Ebola costumes and sexy Ebola costumes and things that are out there. We can't control those, but on Halloween we can.
That's a great example. And I know we talked briefly about this. It was really brief. When I asked you, some people think there's a connection between Halloween and Satanism. Mm-hmm. And you said there wasn't, or was?
No, not really. There's a very tiny, it overlaps in very small ways. Because Halloween has always been associated with witchcraft, and from the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th century, with that kind of people accused of witchcraft, and witches are associated with Satan. It has that kind of guilt by association, and this is a holiday for witches and folklore, and witches are associated with Satan, so therefore the holiday is associated with Satan. And some people do believe that. I mean, there are churches that do believe that, because mostly Halloween's imagery can be seen as imagery from hell rather than imagery of death. It's really imagery of death, but some people see those skulls and things like that as images of hell. So you get that it can be confused with that. And then there was Anton LaVey had the Church of Satan for a while. He was a Hollywood actor who became famous for this, and he published the Satanic Bible. Right. This is like the 60s and 70s. And there was a lot of interest in that. And he claimed that Halloween was one of the holidays that Satanists celebrated. On the other hand, you have people who study cult religions that say that Satanism is the largest religion that doesn't really exist. And at its highest, it was 300 or 500 people. And usually it's groups of Satanists or 2 or 3 teenagers that pass through it and go on to something else. So Halloween glances off that, but it really, historically, it doesn't have anything to do with Satan. It has more to do with bringing your herds in from summer pasture.
Well, I guess that makes me feel better. Now we'll get to the fun stuff in our last few minutes. Where did the Jackolantern come from?
Oh, Jackolantern is a name that was given to a actual scientific phenomenon. It's a disappearing light. It's a light, it's swamp gas. Has a Latin name, but it was called Jackolantern by most people because it traveled like a man with a lantern. But it was a light that would zoom around, and if you tried to follow it, it would disappear. A combustible gas is what it was. But when in the 19th century, when kids discovered that they could take an old pumpkin and hollow it out, carve a face in it or another, put a candle in it, float it on a stick, and hang it in front of a farmer's window late at night in the fall when it was really dark and scare them to death and then run away, this pumpkin trick became known as a jack-o'-lantern trick because it appeared and then disappeared. And it only became it became a stationary jack-o'-lantern when Victorian hostesses discovered what a cool-looking thing it was and used it to decorate their Halloween parties. And to this day, it sits on the porch. It doesn't move anymore, but once it did.
Now, that's amazing. Now, didn't they originally use a turnip?
In Ireland and yeah, the Irish still and Scottish sometimes still do.
Oh, really?
They would carve a vegetable like a turnip to represent, sometimes to represent the souls who they were remembering at this time of year. Remember, it's All Souls Day, or the dead who they believed might be wandering around, to guide them home. Put a little light in the window to guide them home, and they would set out food for them, maybe a chair by the fire to make sure they were welcome back.
Interesting. And what about the bobbing of apples?
That, you find that way, way, way back in history, and usually it's associated with fortune telling of some sort. I don't think it is anymore. It's just kind of a game. But it used to be that you would, the first to get the apple might be the first to marry, or the first to have money, or the first to have good luck, or the first to, have a long life. But it was associated with different kind of omens or portents.
That's interesting. I always wondered where the bobbing of the apples came from. And the candy tradition, you were saying did that come around the Victorian period, or was that way before?
It was after, because
It was after.
yeah, because on Halloween most treats and most food that you found at parties was homemade. Just like costumes were first homemade because there was no mass production. And although you did start to get boxed costumes and mass manufactured candy, between the World Wars, it was after World War II that really the candy companies got into Halloween, and you saw advertising, and Mars and even the tobacco companies got into candy manufacturing.
Well, I wanted to thank you so much. What a wonderful little journey as we took for the last 2,500 years as we covered Halloween. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
I wanted to show once again, this is her book on the American holiday and American history on Halloween by Lesley Bannatyne. She has her new book, Halloween Nation, describing why we're so fascinated by about Halloween. And I want to thank you as well for joining us. If you want to get more information on the Circle of Insight, you can go to facebook.com/Circle of Insight, where you can read daily updates, make comments about today's show or past shows, as well as find out what's coming up next. Our next show we'll be on God. Who is he? So we'll tackle those questions the next time. Once again, remember our simple motto: wherever there's psychology involved, we are there. See you next time, everyone.